Hello and welcome to my channel. In this lecture we'll discuss the olfactory and limbic systems. So let's start. Olfaction, of course, is one of the special senses, and it's unique and different than the other senses in that it does not have a thalamic relay before reaching the cortex. Remember that. So it goes directly to the olfactory cortex or the pyriform cortex. There are three types of cells or receptors: the basal stem cells for regeneration, and these cells, by the way, they used in regenerating parts of the CNS, like in injuries of the spinal cord, for example. They extract these cells from the olfactory mucosa. And support cells, called the sustentacular cells, for the nutrition and support of the cells or the receptors, and the olfactory receptor neurons, which are bipolar neurons, as you can see here. These are the olfactory bipolar receptors in the olfactory mucosa. This is the olfactory mucosa, this is bone, this is the olfactory bulb, and the beginning of the olfactory tract to be oriented. Unmyelinated axons pass through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid. Remember that in the head and neck. Two synapses with what's so-called the mitral cells in structures called the glomeruli. This is a glomerulus, site of synapse with the mitral cells of the olfactory bulb. In embryology, they develop from the CNS, so it's not part of the peripheral nervous system. Axons, as mentioned, synapse with the mitral cells in the glomeruli of the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory tract formed divides into medial and lateral stria at the inferior surface of the brain. This is the olfactory tract here, and this is the lateral stria, and this is the medial stria. This is the optic nerve, of course. Lateral and medial stria. See that? Lateral and medial stria. The medial stria will form or share in the formation of the anterior commissure, and the lateral stria, see, goes to the what's so-called the pyriform cortex or the olfactory cortex, which is this area. This is the pyriform cortex. This is what's so-called the entorhinal cortex or the medial parahippocampal gyrus. It's part of the limbic system, and you can see here the inferior surface or the inferior aspect of the hypothalamus. These are the mammillary bodies, and this is the cut section of the midbrain with the crus cerebri and substantia nigra and the red nuclei, and here the cerebral aqueduct with the periaqueductal gray and the colliculi, superior colliculi. This is to be oriented. This is anterior, of course, and this is posterior. Part of the olfactory cortex that projects like a mountain, as you can see here, this is called the uncus. Okay? And since the limbic system comprises the entorhinal cortex or the medial parahippocampal gyrus with the superior structures like the hippocampus, the hippocampal formation, and the dentate gyrus, they are closely associated or closely connected, the olfactory and limbic systems, and that's why we study them together. Some axons of the medial stria, as mentioned, they go to the septal area. The septal area is the area below the lamina terminalis on the medial surface of the brain. You can see it in the sagittal section of the brain. And other axons cross as the anterior commissure. These axons inhibit the mitral cells in the contralateral olfactory bulb to help in localization of olfactory stimulant. Axons in the lateral stria terminate in the pyriform cortex, which is the primary olfactory cortex of the uncus, and in the amygdala, we will come to this later, the amygdala part of the limbic system. What's so-called the medial forebrain bundle, or the MFB, connects the olfactory cortex with the hypothalamus and brainstem to regulate autonomic responses like arousal through the reticular formation, salivation, and gastric contraction. This is a coronal section of the front part of the brain. This is the caudate nucleus and the lateral ventricle with the septum pellucidum here. This is a cut section of the corpus callosum. The cingulate gyrus, this is the lateral sulcus, and the insula you can see here. And as we studied before with the basal nuclei, this is the claustrum, this is the external capsule, this is the lentiform nucleus with the globus pallidus and putamen. It's well evident here, and this is the internal capsule descending between the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. Now, this is the anterior commissure we were talking about. See, this is the anterior commissure that's formed primarily by the medial stria of the olfactory tract. The limbic system. Limbic system, it's like a circle or semicircle around the center of the brain. It regulates memory, emotions. Homeostasis means the internal environment of the body, and motivational state. And constitutes the cortical and nuclear areas. Cortical areas like the cingulate gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, the subcallosal area means the area beneath the corpus callosum, and the insula. We saw that. See, remember the cingulate and the insula here. This is the parahippocampal gyrus, and this is the hippocampal formation here, starting or beginning in the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. Also, nuclear structures like the amygdala, the hippocampal formation proper, anterior and mediodorsal thalamic nuclei, septal nuclei in the septal area in the forebrain, and nucleus accumbens. And if you remember, the nucleus accumbens is the gray matter communicating or connecting the anterior part of the lentiform nucleus, to be precise, the putamen part, with the caudate nucleus. This is called the nucleus accumbens, and it's just anterior to the corpus striatum, which is the connection itself. It's anterior to this connection. Amygdala, this is the amygdala here in the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, or in the temporal lobe to be precise. It's almond shaped. Recently it was discovered that its function is related to fear. It's located anterior to the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle and tail of caudate. Actually, it receives the tail of the caudate nucleus. Tail of caudate nucleus curves like that and comes into the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. It's not this is not the caudate nucleus, this is the fornix. We studied this with commissural fibers. And the amygdala is associated with emotion of fear, and it has a role in autonomic and neuroendocrine pathways. This is the amygdala, part of the limbic system. Connections to the amygdala are bidirectional. It means to and from the amygdala. And they follow mainly three pathways: the uncinate fasciculus, the stria terminalis, and the ventral amygdalofugal pathway. Fugal means fleeing or leaving. So it's the fibers that left the amygdala. The uncinate fasciculus is a connection with cortical areas. Okay. Connections with septal area and the hypothalamus through the stria terminalis. This is the stria terminalis that follows the course of the fornix. See how it ends in the hypothalamus and the septal area. And connections with thalamic nuclei, brainstem and forebrain structures through the amygdalofugal pathways. Okay. The nucleus accumbens, I told you it's here. It's together, the structure is called the corpus striatum. Anterior to the corpus striatum is the nucleus accumbens. It's in the forebrain where head of caudate and putamen are continuous with one another, as you can clearly see here. This is a coronal section of the brain. To be oriented, this is the lateral ventricle, this is caudate nucleus, this is the lentiform nucleus or the putamen part, and this is part of the internal capsule. This is the corpus callosum, cingulate gyrus, and this is the ancilla here. Okay, and this is the area of the limbic system proper, where the hippocampal formation and subiculum. This cortex is called the subiculum, by the way. Afferents to the nucleus accumbens from amygdala through the amygdalofugal pathways, as mentioned before, from the hippocampus through the fornix, from basal forebrain area through the stria terminalis, and from the ventral tegmentum through the medial forebrain bundle. Efferents from the nucleus accumbens to the hypothalamus, globus pallidus. This comprises a connection with the motor system that controls the motor activity of the body, and brainstem nuclei through the medial forebrain bundle. The nucleus accumbens itself acts as a gratification center or a reward center, the center that the drugs, narcotics work upon. That gives the sensation of euphoria with the usage of drugs, and it's involved in addiction, of course. So acts as a gratification center and involved in addiction. The septal nuclei. This is the septal area here. Rostral to the anterior commissure. This is the anterior commissure. This is the pituitary. By the way, this is the medial surface of the brain, and this is anterior and this is posterior. You can see part of the cerebellum here, and this is the temporal lobe. Pardon me. It's involved in pleasurable behavior, means the centers that produce euphoria. Afferents from amygdala and hippocampus, olfactory tract, and monoaminergic nuclei in the brainstem, and also connect to habenular nuclei. We talked about that with the diencephalon. It forms the epithalamus, as you remember, the pineal gland and the habenular trigon, with the habenular commissure between the two habenular trigons. The neurons there are cholinergic in the wall and roof of the third ventricle, axons of which project to reticular formation and play a role in the sleep-wake cycle to control the circadian rhythm, or to part of the circadian rhythm that controls the levels of the hormones all over the body along the day, the course of the day. There are some hormones that increase at night, for example, like the growth hormone, and at daylight, like the corticosteroids or the cortisol, and what regulates this is the circadian rhythm cycle. The hippocampal formation, this is the hippocampal formation. See that? By the way, this is a superior view of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. This is anterior here, and this is posterior. This is medial, and this is lateral. So you are looking at the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. The formation is in the medial ventral temporal lobe, as you can see here. Consists of the hippocampus, dentate gyrus, and the subiculum, the part of the cortex I showed you before on a previous plate. So the hippocampal formation is the hippocampal. All these are called the hippocampus campal formation, but this is the hippocampus proper. So the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus, as you can see here, and the subiculum. It plays role in memory process, actually in short-term memory and conversion the short-term memory into a long-term one. This is a coronal section of the left side. This is medial. This is lateral, superior and inferior. And this is the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, with the cut section of the hippocampus, hippocampal formation as a whole, and hippocampus proper, which is this part. See, this is the dentate gyrus, this is the hippocampus, and this is the subiculum, the part of the cortex we're talking about, and the parahippocampal gyrus on the inferior surface of the brain. The terms used are dentate gyrus and the corneo-ammonis, or Ammon's horn, because corneo-ammonis refers to Egyptian king Ammon, or god Ammon, who has the head of a ram. The corneo-ammonis is abbreviated CA, corneo-ammonis, and it's composed or differentiated into 4 fields, CA1 through CA4, as you can see here, CA1, CA2, CA3, and CA4. And they're all close to the dentate gyrus, the one that we saw before in the superior view of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. There is what's so-called the Schaefer Collaterals, or the Schaefer Pathway. It's a connection or axons collaterals given off by the CA3 cells, which are pyramidal cells actually in the hippocampus. And these collaterals project to the area CA1 of the hippocampus and are an integral part of memory formation and the emotional network of the Papez circuit. Papez circuit, we will get to it later in this lecture. So remember, the Schaefer Collaterals is axons projecting from CA3 to CA1, and it's important in the course of memory formation and emotional status related to the Papez circuit. Afferents to the hippocampus, input by the entorhinal cortex. We saw that on the inferior surface of the cerebrum, on the medial side of the temporal lobe. And neurons from the entorhinal cortex project to hippocampus formation through two pathways. One is called the Perforant Pathway, and the other is called the Alveolar Pathway. So the Perforant Pathway and the Alveolar pathways. The Perforant Pathway, it courses directly, as you can see here, to the dentate gyrus. Okay, sorry, this one. The perforant pathway courses directly to the dentate gyrus, as you can see here, and the alveolar pathway, which is this one, directly on to the CA1, remember, CA1 through CA4, to CA1 and CA3 areas of the hippocampus. Remember those pathways. Efferents primarily from the subiculum and form the fornix, which begins as the alveus. Alveus is the layer just above or on top of the hippocampus. Then the fibria is the fimbria when they collect together on their way backwards. Remember the fornix, it was C-shaped. So if you're talking about the origin from the hippocampal formation, the alveus is on top of the hippocampus, then it collects into the fimbria, then it curves under the corpus callosum as the body and columns of the fornix, and then ends into the mammillary body after dividing as at the anterior commissure into precommissural fornix and postcommissural fornix to reach the nucleus accumbens, the septal area, the medial frontal cortex, and the mammillary nucleus, ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, and the anterior nucleus of the dorsal thalamus. It's all connections at the anterior end of the fornix before it ends primarily in the mammillary body. Last is the Papez circuit. It's an important circuit involved in emotional status and memory. Fibers from the subiculum through fornix, see that? Through fornix, this is the fornix, go to the mammillary nuclei. This is the mammillary nucleus here, or mammillary body, and through mammillothalamic tract, this is the mammillothalamic tract, to the thalamus, to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus to be precise. Then from the thalamus through internal capsule, as you can see here, to the cingulate gyrus. This is the cingulate gyrus. This is anterior, this is posterior, superior, and inferior. Again, it starts from the subiculum through the fornix to the mammillary nuclei. This is the mammillary nucleus. Then through mammillothalamic tract to the thalamus, to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. Then from the thalamus through internal capsule to the cingulate gyrus. Then from the cingulate gyrus back to the parahippocampal gyrus, as you can see here. This is the parahippocampal gyrus here, and the entorhinal cortex. They are all both visual at the inferior surface of the brain, and the hippocampal formation. So again, from the subiculum through the fornix to the mammillary body or the mammillary nucleus, mammillothalamic tract, thalamus through the internal capsule to the cingulate gyrus, and backwards to the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampal parahippocampal gyrus and the hippocampal formation. This is an important circuit involved in emotional status and in the memory or processing of memory, practiced by the cerebrum. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.